Let's talk to Sir Iain Duncan Smith. He's former Conservative MP and former Conservative leader, I should say, and MP for Chingford and Woodford Green, which is in Tier 2. But Sir Iain, given that you have been one of those leading the battles against lots of these lockdown restrictions without evidence presented for them, I doubt there was much cheering about your constituency being in Tier 2 yesterday.
Well, I'm obviously relieved that we are in Tier 2, but Tier 2 is a much tighter Tier 2 than was existing before the lockdown. And so, it's a muted sort of, yes, I'm okay. But the truth is that these tiers that have been brought back to us are much tougher. Tier 3 is basically the lockdown pretty much in all but name. And half the country are now pretty much in that lockdown. The other half look really close to the lockdown. And that's the real problem, which is that we did this, as you said earlier on, we did the full lockdown on the basis that it would apparently have a significant effect. And yet, before we've even reached the end of it, they're now saying that not only just coming out of it, but we're actually going to stay in or swathes of the country will stay in a very significant lockdown, with the hospitality industry absolutely being hammered in the 1 month that they really need to be able to sustain themselves into the next into the spring.
This is the thing. I mean, both the logical reasoning and the evidence is really questionable here, because we were told by the Prime Minister we would go into tiers previously before the lockdown to avoid going into a lockdown. And then we were told after just a couple of weeks that the tiers weren't working, which was why we had to go into a lockdown. And now, because the lockdown has worked so well, we're going into tougher tiers. And so areas that are going into areas that were actually doing fine beforehand are now going into tougher restrictions than they were previously. And yet Boris Johnson yesterday said the tiered approach was working, even though he had said quite specifically it wasn't. Yeah. And that's why we've gone into lockdown. And in fact, he's right. The tiered approach was working, because we saw infection rates were going down, certainly in the top two tiers previously. But we are in Alice in Wonderland territory, where the Prime Minister appears to think that we don't have video evidence of what he said before. Which is true? Were tiers working? Weren't they working? Was the lockdown working? Wasn't it working? Do you know the answers? Have you been given any evidence for either?
Well, no. I mean, actually, you say Alice in Wonderland. If you recall, the Queen says first the sentence, then the evidence. And, of course, this is exactly where we're going. The tier system was actually working. And they denied that originally. They produced some very dodgy figures, a SAGE group, about how we were going to have, thousands and thousands of people dying, and how the tier system was simply failing. Actually, last week, you saw all the areas flattening and falling, Liverpool cascading downwards, and many others in a similar pattern, all before the effects of the lockdown could be felt, which wasn't until last weekend. Now we're in the week where we begin to see the effects of the lockdown. And before we've really even seen what those effects are, the government's out and announcing that we come out of lockdown into lockdown. And that's the real problem. There's nothing for people to hope for. There's nothing for businesses to cling on to. You said earlier on, there was with your other guest, about how, what is a substantial meal. The reality is that people are going to make their own decisions about this. We govern by consent, not by diktat or ordinance. We govern by consent, and the public have to believe that what we're asking them to do is rational, reasonable, and fair. And I have to say, I really can't say that these are. I think, you noticed yesterday when the document that was briefing was meant to be released with regards to the statement, actually what they'd done is they'd failed to eradicate all the debating points around it, and you had a document full of question marks. In other words, so much of this isn't done by a clear criteria. It's done by judgment. People going, let me think, wait a minute. I think that looks not good enough, so let's put that into tier 3. Okay, this lot over here who are worse, well, they can stay in tier 2. And that's been one of the things. There are all sorts of examples of people, of areas with lower levels going into tier 3 than some who are in tier 2. Other areas that were in tier 3 in a seriously halving their infection rates on a severe downward curve, are stuck in tier 3 without any reward or any promise for that. Those hospitality businesses will simply fail. This is the problem that we've got at the moment. No cost-benefit analysis has been produced. And without that, the public will begin to wonder what this is all about. MPs are in a sort of fury at the moment about decisions taken in their areas. Kent, for example, cannot understand why they've been lurched into Tier 3. I noticed Stratford-upon-Avon, the Stratford area, that's gone up from Tier 1 to Tier 3, yet their levels are lower than many who are already in Tier 3. This is the problem, that the tier system was meant to be fair. Why we didn't return to the original tier system and then make decisions with more evidence about what had happened in the lockdown. And I have to say, I think that there has been a pound of flesh demanded here from Sage, that because the government has said they want to ease off for 5 days at Christmas, they've basically said, unless you tighten all this up and absolutely put people into most of the country into the tightest spheres, particularly Tier 3, then we will be demanding a lockdown in January of the same quality that we had before, because they're very concerned about those
again,
5 days at Christmas.
We don't have... Sage isn't in charge. Sage, the
No, I know
scientist,
that,
Chris Whitty, Patrick Vallance, it's not their decision. They are able to give medical advice, and we've seen some very questionable stats and graphs being used by them, which have been, again, often proved untrue within hours of it being published. Yep. Not as a matter of opinion, proven to be untrue, that 4,000 a day claim and the like, deaths. But it's, the decision is for the government. The decision is for the Prime Minister to make with his ministers about what to do. We're told yesterday that mass testing is the route out. We understand Robert Jenrick, who's going to be on the show in about half an hour's time, saying that you've got a chance to move out of your tier. Boris Johnson said your tier is not your destiny. Every area has the means of escape, and this is through mass testing. And we're told the reason why Liverpool is in Tier 2 and not in Tier 3 is because of mass testing. I put out a chart on Twitter. Anyone can have a look at it. It's official data. Yeah, we know the Liverpool infections started plummeting, not going down a bit. I mean plummeting down in early October when they were in Tier 2, before they went into Tier 3 and a month before mass testing started. The government is claiming that they were able to move out of Tier 3 because mass testing brought their infection rate down. Yeah. That is provably a lie. Why do you think the government's lying to us?
Well, I have to say, we've had real problems with government statements claiming all sorts of things. They've claimed mass testing, you're right. The figures you show are absolutely categorically true. In fact, if anything, there was a plateauing for a short period after mass testing came in before it followed the same descent that it had before. And they were also up and running, many of them last week, claiming that the flattening and falling of the infection rates was all down to the lockdown. Well, that's simply not true. Just not true. We only now see the beginnings of the effects of the lockdown. So all of that was to do with the tier system. I really do wish, this is the point I'm making, we govern by consent. Unless people are seen to be fair, rational and reasonable, then the public will no longer grant their consent to what is being asked of them. And it's not a case of, and threatening people, by the way, these ridiculous polls that say, do you approve of lockdown to save lives? Well, who's going to say no to a question like that? This is a classic case of the old sort of triangulation. You set up a set of false parameters. People will always go for the one that seems reasonable. Okay. The truth is, it's not as simple as that. It's about keeping business going. It's about livelihoods, lives. It's about mental health for people who have been made redundant. It's about decisions over pubs, as you were just hearing before, who are being told, unless you serve a substantial meal, no matter that you've got people sitting at the tables, no matter that you're protecting. There's no evidence, by the way, that the pubs were the cause of the spike. It was more to do with people at home meeting up, later on in the hours, drinking, getting together in groups they shouldn't have been. That's where most of the problem came from. It didn't come from well-run pubs and restaurants. Indeed. Who are desperate now that December will be lost to them.
Let me ask you a question, Reg. And I don't know the answer to this question. I'm hoping you do. You've been in government. You know a lot of these people in government right now personally. Some of them you would consider to be good friends and not just colleagues. Why are they doing this? Why is the government? Why is Boris Johnson? Why are all these other ministers? Why are they pushing us from tiers to lockdown to tiers, leading to mass... we know not just mass economic devastation, as we heard from Rishi Sunak in the spending review, but also we know the evidence is really clear now that we will lose more younger lives in the long run than we will lose to COVID from these measures. They must see the same data that you and I see. They've got the best experts to advise them. Why are they doing this?
I think because the SAGE advisory process is a flawed one. I genuinely mean this. I think that there is no balance in it. there is no concern or reason why those inside should pay the slightest bit of interest into what's going on economically and the effects on health. Their sole purpose is to look at COVID. And when you have that in your ear the whole time, that, as you said earlier on, reports that seem to accentuate the worst possible outcomes that you could even begin to believe. I mean, the death rate that was going to outstrip Brazil, a place with a population 3 or 4 times ours, and with a much more lax process. All of these things became irrational. And I think it's very difficult. We're facing the biggest crisis we've faced for years. We've seen the effect on the economy, on jobs that's going to come about, the worst collapse in 300 years because of this. We're not alone, by the way. The rest of Europe and other countries are in the same similar sort of boat. But the problem we've got right now is that we have become so completely obsessed that COVID is the only problem that we face of any scale, and people are worried generally about being accused of causing deaths, when everybody knows that everybody is doing what they can. There's no individual to blame for this, that in actual fact this came from China and we're suffering from it. But the problem is this pounding away makes everybody start to take a very narrow view of what's going on. And that's our problem. We need to broaden, balance, and carry the public with us. Otherwise, they simply won't obey these rules. And that's the tragedy.